In this video, we're going to show you how to build a memorial flag display case using Project Lumber and inlays from Osborne. Stay tuned for some tips and tricks, and we'll be right back. To get started with this project, we first need to mill down our 5/4 lumber to the proper width and length for our project. We chose to go with red oak for our display case, but you can choose from a wide number of wood species on our website with this 5/4 lumber. The 5/4 lumber will need to be milled through a planer or joiner to get it to the final thickness, so here I'm just cutting it down to a rough length so that it's more manageable to work through my planer. I'm leaving these cuts about an inch oversized so that I can come back later and get a cut to the exact dimension of my case. Next, I bring the thickness of the boards down to 3/4 of an inch using my benchtop planer. We're going to be adding a 1 inch wide face frame to the front, but to keep the weight of the case down, we can use 3/4 inch material for the rest of the assembly. Once our lumber is milled down to its final thickness, we can rip it to its final width of 3.5 inches. Finally, we can cut the boards down to their final length. The bottom board will be the longest board at 25 inches, and the two side boards will meet at a 45 degree and be 18 inches long each. Next, I'm going to cut in the channels that the acrylic and the case back will sit into. I'm making these channels 1/4 inch deep and 1/4 inch wide to keep things simple. You can cut these on the table saw, and these will be cut on the very outside of the boards on one side. Depending on your table saw blade, you may need to adjust the fence for multiple passes to cut these channels completely. The most difficult part of this build is cutting the 22.5 degree angles on the bottom corners. To make this easier, we'll create a simple jig for our table saw fence that will allow us to cut the boards vertically instead of horizontally. This will allow us to cut a steeper angle while keeping our hands a safe distance from the saw blade. To get started, I'm ripping some 1x material to the height and width of my fence. This will allow me to make a square cut without the risk of anything shifting during the cut. Once these are ripped to the correct width of your table saw fence, cut them down to roughly 10 inches in length, and repeat this process for the top board. Next, we can measure and cut the boards for our vertical fence, which we'll use to clamp the Project Lumber to. This board just needs to be tall enough to support your working material and making sure that it doesn't move during the cut. Next, we can assemble these 5 pieces around our table saw fence, making sure we get a proper square and tight fit. It's important to use some kind of right angle square here to make sure that everything is in line with your table saw, which will ensure your cut is square as well. I've added a secondary fence that I can use to keep my board square vertically, and I'm also going to add some holes in the middle that I can use a clamp for clamping my working material to. Next, we can use a digital angle gauge to get the correct 22.5 degree angle on our saw blade, and then run our first board through, making sure it sits flush with the bottom of my table saw. It's very easy to get confused on these cuts with the orientation of the boards, so make sure you keep in mind and lay everything out before making your cuts for a successful project. The top angles will be 45 degrees, making a perfect 90 degree angle at the top of the case. We can cut these using a miter saw and then glue everything up using wood glue and a strap clamp. While our case is drying, we can mill down the material for our face frame. For this, we're going to be creating a 1 inch face frame with the edge grain showing on the front of the case. This means whatever thickness you plane the lumber to will be the width of the face frame on the front of the case. This will make sure that the wood grain on the top side of the case runs in the same direction as the boards that we glued up. Next, we can cut the face frame boards to their final length, which is the same exact measurements as our main case material. It's important to make sure that these cuts are the exact same as the cuts we made previously to make sure there are no awkward seams in our final assembly. Once our lumber is milled down, we can cut these same angles on the face frame material and move on to gluing this up as well. Once everything is dry, we can give everything a light sanding to get rid of any unwanted glue squeeze out. This won't be the final sanding for this project, so no need to make everything perfect just yet. The next step for this project is to add the American flag inlays to the top sides of our case. For this process, we'll use our router table as always to route a channel in the desired locations for these inlays. This is going to be a 1/32 of an inch deep channel, but the width will depend on which inlay you've selected. If you're interested in a more in-depth tutorial about how to install decorative wooden inlays from Osborne, you can reference this video above. Once our inlays are cut to size, we can use a small amount of wood glue in the channel to hold them in place. It's important to avoid any excess glue squeeze out when installing these inlays, as they can only be lightly sanded before finishing. Once our inlays are installed, we can use a straight edge and some clamps to keep some pressure on them while they dry. For this project, we chose acrylic for our front glass, which we sourced from our local hardware store. If you don't have a way to cut acrylic or glass yourself for your project, you can reach out to a glass shop, which can usually cut it for you for a small fee. Once we verified that the acrylic fits in the channels that we created earlier, we can use a light amount of wood glue to glue the face frame onto the front side of the case. It's very important to avoid excess glue squeeze out, as it can stain the acrylic on your case. Once our face frame is centered, we can attach some clamps and allow it to dry. The final step for assembly is to add the case back, which we'll cut from 1/4 inch plywood. I selected to cut this on the bandsaw as it was the easiest tool that I had available, but you can also cut this on a table saw or a miter saw depending on your tools. Now that the face frame is dry, we can test fit the case back, making sure that it's a proper fit. This should sit flush with the back of the case and allow us to use some picture frame turn buttons to keep it in place. Before installing the flag and the case back, we want to make sure to sand everything to 150 grit and apply the finish of your choice. We chose to go with a light stain as it helps complement the wooden inlays well. Just be sure to mask the acrylic using some painter's tape to make sure that you don't stain the acrylic itself. Now that our case is finished, we can install the turn buttons on the back side of the display that will hold our case back in place. I chose to install 9 of these turn buttons along the back side of my case just to make sure that everything is secure. First, I'll lay them out in the proper location and then mark them out so that I can pre-drill using a small drill bit. It's very important to use a drill bit that is smaller than your screw to make sure that you still have enough bite, since these are very, very tiny screws for these turn buttons. Once our holes are pre-drilled, we can install them using a screwdriver, making sure to avoid over-tightening. Finally, we can insert our flag and case back and take a closer look at our finished project. Thank you for joining me for this special episode of the Builder Studio. If you're interested in learning more about the wooden inlays or the project lumber from Osborne, be sure to check out the links in the description below. As always, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment, and we'll see you next time in the Builder Studio.